So I'm Derek Fowler. I work at the Trainline, and I'm here today to talk about AWS CodeDeploy. And I think this session was kind of sold as the story so far, but I've kind of binned off quite a lot of the stuff about our migration and kind of tried to focus mostly on the things about CodeDeploy that are probably more relevant to most people. So, yeah, I work at the Trainline, as I said. It's 1.6 billion sales annually, 27 million visitors every month. We've got like 8.5 million downloads of the mobile app, things like that. So it's quite a high traffic website, and all of that stuff is running mostly on .NET and SQL Server on Windows. We've got Node.js and Oracle databases running on Linux. It's 324 virtual servers, and we're in the middle, sort of in the middle of a big migration towards AWS. So the current data center that we're hosting is going to be decommissioned fairly soon. So we've got quite a big incentive to try and shift everything somewhere else. And the architectural decision was to let's go for AWS. That's we wanted to go with a cloud provider. That's the cloud provider that met most of our requirements and would kind of provide us with a fairly smooth transition. And as part of that, we created a platform services team, so a team which is aimed at writing platform as a service style services to wrap around the interactions with the AWS API and various other APIs to try and give our developers and other teams a better experience than we had previously. So the main issue that we were focusing on, one of the big things we needed to improve was the issue of getting code onto machines. And in the scale of getting code onto machines, it looks something like this. So it's either from this end, you just say, here, take this thing, or you go all the way down the other end of the scale to some kind of X copy solution where I've got this file, I need to put it on that server over there, let's X copy it, and I've got the IP and access to all the to the directories and things like that. And AWS offers a few different things for achieving this. I mean, things like Elastic Beanstalk is very much the here, take this option, where you're just going to give it a package and it'll shift that thing right up there, and you don't really know anything about where it's being hosted or what it's being run on. And CodeDeploy is more towards the middle, so it gives you a lot more flexibility around your deployment options. So I guess one question: who here is running on AWS at the moment? And is anyone using CodeDeploy? Anyone considering using it? Okay. So the stuff that I'm going to go into is less about how it works and more about some oddities that you maybe wouldn't expect. So the general model of how you set stuff up, as you would imagine, it's kind of similar to a lot of other deployment management tools. You have these kind of primitives that exist within CodeDeploy itself. So the concept of an application and the concept of a deployment group, which is a target for your deployment. And then you've got a one-to-many relationship between these two. And then the deployment group can relate to auto-scaling groups, or it can relate to tagged instances, or a combination of both. And again, there's a one-to-many relationship between these two as well. So I can have a deployment group which is targeting multiple auto-scaling groups, or a combination of auto-scaling groups and tagged instances. So the ways that you might set this stuff up, one of the examples is, say you're hosting a service in a blue-green manner. You might have an application defined as your maybe a payment API, and then a blue and green deployment group for that thing, targeting blue and green auto-scaling groups. Another example might be, say, an auto-scaling group which hosts all of the workers in your system. And you might have a couple of applications targeting this same auto-scaling group, and those can be deployed independently and upgraded independently and things like that. So one of the first things you'll come across when you start to use CodeDeploy is, in order to tell it how it should be deploying your revision, your new version onto the deployment target. There's a couple of different default deployment configurations that you can use. These come, it's kind of what you would imagine. So I can either say, deploy to all of the instances in the deployment target all at once, do half at a time, or do one at a time. But the thing that you may not consider to be quite that logical is that the success criteria for those different things are quite surprising. So, for example, the all at once configuration, the success criteria for that are if all but one fails. So that's kind of quite surprising. And you know, I've got a deployment that appears to be okay, but nine out of 10 instances may have failed, which is really not an ideal scenario to be in a lot of cases. And similarly, the half at a time deployment configuration has some issues deploying to half of one. So if you've got an auto-scaling group which has one instance in it, it's unlikely in a production scenario, but potentially if you're like in a development environment or something like that, you might see failures when you try and deploy and you're using half at a time, but you've only got one instance. So the other big thing to consider is limits. So if all of the AWS services, as well as services from other cloud providers, have account limits. And for CodeDeploy, it's no different. You've got a limit of 40 applications per account. You can have 10 deployment groups in each of those accounts. But the key one here, and the one that I'm going to talk about quite a lot, is this one at the bottom. You can have 10 concurrent deployments at a time for that account. And it throws up some surprising things. So what is one of these deployments? What counts as a deployment? Well, it really depends. So in CodeDeploy, if it depends on how the thing is being deployed. If you as the user are triggering a new revision, I'm saying I want to deploy this new thing, and you have, say, an auto-scaling group which is running 10 instances. When you say, here, deploy this thing to these instances, CodeDeploy is going to distribute that package out to all the instances to be installed. It does that via an agent that's running on the instances. It's also going to record that particular revision as the current revision that's assigned for this particular deployment group, this target. And if you do it that way, that counts as one deployment. Now, the thing that is quite interesting is that obviously, if I'm using an auto-scaling group, one of the things that's going to happen is it's going to be scaling up and down. And when that's the case, say, for example, I've got one running instance already with the stuff installed, and I scale up by 10 instances. In this case, CodeDeploy is going to use this store of, which is the correct revision that should be installed to those instances, and it's going to just distribute that out to the instances. But in this case, that counts as 10 deployments. So when you do a scale up like this, you've hit the limit of 10 deployments already. So what happens in that case? If we scale up in this case by 11 instances, this 11th one is going to fail. And the reason for that is that CodeDeploy does not queue deployments. So you've got this allocation of 10 deployments. You can fill all of those up, and after you get to the end, any additional deployments are going to fail. And the other interesting thing to note about this is that if any deployments on the instance do fail, when you're doing a scale up, the instance is going to be killed. So we've had a look at if I might have one package deployed to a single instance, but what about if I'm trying to deploy multiple applications to my instances? So I've got maybe several applications all targeting the same auto-scaling group. What happens in this case? So one of the things that we can look at is, say for example, I've got 6 applications. I've scaled up, and they're all going to try and deploy. If I have one of those is a bad revision, so one of those is a package whose installer is maybe corrupted or something like that, it just doesn't work when it comes to install, that bad revision is going to cause the entire instance to be killed, so that the instance will be terminated by auto-scaling, and then it's going to be, by default, it's going to be respawned, and you'll get a new instance spinning up. But when that happens, the bad revision is going to come into effect again. It's going to prevent the instance from spinning up again, and you'll end up with a perpetual respawn of instances. And one of the tricky things here is that if your instances are starting very rapidly, say for example they're able to spin up and start deployments in a matter of minutes, then this perpetual respawn can lead to quite high charges. So you might get charged every time it spins up and is seen to be successfully running. You might get charged a minimum of an hour for each of those times. So you can rack up quite high charges in a very short period of time. So how about if, looking at this case, all of our deployments are okay? So I've got my 6 applications, they all deployed fine, everything looks okay. But my ASG then scales up by 2. So in this case, I'm going to get 2 failing because I've hit my deployment limit of 10 deployments. I've got 2 additional deployments. I've got 12 deployments. I'm over the limit. So in this case again, these 2 instances are going to be killed by auto-scaling, and they're both going to respawn. But the next time that happens, the same thing is going to happen again. And those 2 instances are going to be deadlocked on this shared resource. I've scaled up, I've got a desired capacity in my auto-scaling group of this many. I'm trying to achieve it. Auto-scaling is going to repeatedly try to spin up these instances, but they're deadlocked on this concurrent deployment limit. So it's a bit of this kind of situation. These instances are potentially never going to be able to spin up properly. And the big issue here is that CodeDeploy doesn't allocate these slots of out of the concurrent deployments to the places where they'll do most good. It's not really aware that different applications might be hosted on the same auto-scaling group. So it's not going to, for example, allocate those slots so that this one can succeed. It's going to let this one fail, but this one succeeds, so that the next time this one respawns, it can take 6 out of the 10, and it's got enough to then succeed. It doesn't do that kind of thing. These slots are allocated randomly, so you could potentially have this scenario, but it's highly likely that you wouldn't. So moving on to some more detail about how these deployments work. So a deployment in CodeDeploy is composed of events. And the events are the ones you can see here. So the ones in gold are events that can be specified by the user. The ones in grey are system events, which are always going to run. So these are things like downloading the bundle, which is going and retrieving the revision file to be installed. And then the gold ones are where you specify some script that you want to run. So, for example, before install, after install, these might be where you go and install websites or do something like that. So the interesting thing is the interaction between having multiple applications on an auto-scaling group and this event model. The CodeDeploy agent that's running on this instance, it doesn't parallelize those deployments. It executes in sequence. So it's only ever going to be executing one event at a time, regardless of how many applications you're trying to install. And the way that it works is effectively like swapping from one thread to another on a processor. It interleaves the events, and you'll end up with a random ordering of the events from all of the deployments targeted onto that machine. So, for example, if we have two deployments, I could have the first event from one deployment followed by a couple of events executing from a completely different deployment, and then back again to the first one. So the important thing here is that the deployments are going to, the deployments are going to execute concurrently, but they're not going to execute in parallel when you're on the same instance. So if I'm deploying packages across multiple instances, those deployments are all going to happen in parallel. If I'm targeting one instance, the agent is only running one thing at a time, so they're going to be deploying at the same time, but not parallel. Another important thing is that you can specify timeouts for each of these events, so that the timeout between the event starting and the event ending, a lot of these can be specified by the user, and they can be up to an hour. So an interesting part is that there's also this hidden timeout, which is between the end of one event for a particular deployment and the start of the next event. And that timeout is not something that can be controlled by the user, and that must be less than 5 minutes, because if that 5 minutes is exceeded, then all of the following events are going to be skipped, and this deployment is going to be abandoned. So this deployment is very much at the mercy of however long these concurrent deployments are going to take for their events. So potentially, if this bundle is particularly large and takes a particularly long amount of time to download, it's going to have a knock-on effect to this deployment, and it's going to cause this to always fail. So multiple deployment groups on an ASG, it's perilous, to say the least. And there's a recent blog article from AWS themselves who say that in general, you should avoid associating multiple deployment groups with the same auto-scaling group. So even though the UI, the API, all of that stuff for CodeDeploy supports it, they now say that it really doesn't work. You shouldn't be doing that. And I tend to agree. So yeah, no multiple applications on the same auto-scaling group. So to sum up, make sure you're choosing the correct deployment configuration, or specify a custom one. The most likely is you're going to want to specify a custom one. CodeDeploy, it doesn't queue deployments, so you need to be prepared for those deployments to fail. And related to that, watch out for the bad revisions, because if you don't put in monitoring to try and catch this perpetual respawn, then you can get yourself into a situation where you're paying lots of money. And finally, don't put applications on an ASG, don't put multiple applications on an ASG. CodeDeploy, it works fine with auto-scaling groups supporting one application, but any more than that, and it's really not good. And lastly, there's an under the hood blog post on the AWS blog, and I suggest anyone who's considering using CodeDeploy to go and read that blog post, have a look at it. It's got a lot of good information, including this comment about the multiple applications. So that's all for me. Are there any questions? Have we got time for questions? One question. This guy. It depends. For the current hosting model that we use, probably not, because we're hosting a lot of Windows stuff. So and we're also moving towards microservices. So the services that we're deploying are getting ever smaller. We don't have a good container option at the moment. So trying to deploy multiple services on the same machine, it makes sense for us. You know, we don't need one whole machine to host one of these little services. And also, you know, the more machines we have, the more license costs we have to pay. So our hosting model is certainly not going to change. CodeDeploy, I don't think that's going to change the way it works anytime soon. So probably not is the answer. Okay, thanks very much.